Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Alisa Carroll, and I'm editor-in-chief of Henry Magazine. And we are so pleased and so privileged to welcome you to Fragility Fire, the new ceramics movement, which is the keynote event of Design San Francisco 2022. And if you'll please join me in welcoming three extraordinary individuals who've been so generous to share their time and to be with us today. Their achievements are far too numerous to mention here, but we will try and introduce them properly. First, please welcome Dr. Rachel Gotlieb, who is the Ruth Ripon Curator of Ceramics at the Crocker Art Museum in Sacramento. The Crocker's International Ceramics Collection is one of the largest in the United States, and Dr. Gotlieb is a leading modern and contemporary ceramics specialist with a particular interest in 19th century ceramics. Previously, she was chief curator at the Gardner Museum of Art in Toronto, where her exhibitions included Piece by Piece, which featured a massive performative intervention and installation by one of our other guests today here, Clare Twomey. Clare, we're so delighted to have you, and we congratulate you on your MBE. Clare has just been awarded this January an MBE, so we congratulate her on that incredible achievement. She is an artist and a research fellow at the University of Westminster, who works with clay in large-scale installations, sculpture, and site-specific work. Over the past 10 years, she has exhibited among many other venues at the Victoria and Albert, the Tate, Crafts Council Museum of Modern Art in Kyoto, and within these works, Clare has maintained her concerns with materials, with craft practice, and historic and social context. And please welcome Peter Lane. We are so thrilled to have you, Peter. You have a huge fan base here in San Francisco. Everyone's very excited to see you and your work. Peter is a New York-based ceramic artist who specializes in large-scale architectural installations, monumental furniture, and decorative work. His clients include some of the world's foremost interior designers, including Peter Marino and Shahan Manassian, and his virtuosic commissions can be seen and experienced at the Hotel de Crillon in Paris, at Astrolabe in New York, and most recently at the Armory Show. His 10,000 square foot Brooklyn studio is home to the largest the largest gas kilns in New York. And there he and his team create forms of massive sculptural expression. So we're so honored that all of you were able to share your time with us today. Thank you. And for everyone who's watching, we invite you to learn more about our guests, and you can also find additional resources and information on the history and practice of ceramics in our digital program guide, which you can download at sfdesigncenter.com. So if you don't mind, we would love to begin today just by diving first into your individual practices. Peter and Clare, would you mind just walking us through perhaps a day in your work and sharing a bit about the core concerns that drive what you do? Clare, would you mind starting us off?
Thanks, Lisa. It's really just interesting to be here with everyone on the panel. It's very exciting to meet other people who love clay, so that's great. I think within my studio practice, then if we're looking at a day in the studio, which I'm not in at the moment, but a day in the studio, which is at the Thames Barrier in London, will involve a series of different activities from, depending on whether there's a large team in working on a large project where we're completing something as a team, and I'm a huge believer, as Rachel will know, in bringing teams together to work on specific projects. And the rest of the time in the studio will be me and my assistant, and a lot of my time is spent on research, so developing new works. And the studio is always a staging ground. It's the place where I develop the concepts, trial them, test them, try to understand them. But really, the work is only ever executed in the public realm. So in the studio that I'm in, which is a terrific place to be. There are 400 other artist studios on the same site, so it's kind of magical to be here in London. But within that, the context usually of the pieces of work that I make are referencing the site. So it feels like the studio is the place for research, for investigation. And they can be material, they can be drawn, they can be conversational. So the extent of the work is really coming from what I would call the studio as the staging ground for anything that finds its way into the public realm.
One of the beautiful things, Claire, you've always shared about your making in your artistic practice is that it is all about process. And you have exhibited that so beautifully in your installations. For example, in Time Present and Time Past, your William Morris inspired piece, you had an artist who was creating, or rather two artists, 130 William Morris tiles. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and it's a really great example of how the studio works with all parts of our ceramic history. So a lot of the time, maybe the large installations are made with industry because that's relevant. Because let's say if we talk about the 10,000 flowers we made for the Eden Project, then I didn't make those. We tried to get as close to the history of making them. So the generations of women who'd been taught by other generations who had worked in the factories. So it was really important to maintain that relationship. If I stepped into that relationship, I would be a stranger. So really it was about the lineage of making, which is why the 10,000 flowers were made in the factories rather than in an artisan studio. And the same with the William Morris tiles. So the manufacturing company, Johnson's Tiles, who still have the license to print William Morris tiles, they made the 130 tiles that made up, which will not seem vast to Peter, but was vast to me, the 3 meters by 4 meters enlargement of this 1 meter sketch from William Morris. They were made up in industry, but we traced that history through sharing skill every day with 72 apprentices from the public, who we trained them every day. We had one master painter, male and female, and they would teach somebody from the public every day who volunteered to do this, to learn the art of gold painting, which is no mean feat. So they had to apprentice. It was a one-day apprenticeship. So we had 72 apprentices alongside the master painter who taught skills, but also produced a new layer of decoration over the original William Morris piece. So it was layering these histories, and we had a kiln on site, so they were fired. So the whole thing was this ongoing process, and the sharing of this dialogue between somebody who hadn't experienced the skill and somebody who was well skilled was so much part of that dialogue of sharing.
And you've really expanded the field of practice beyond your studio setting then into this participatory setting in a museum. Peter, may I ask you about your studio process, which is also deeply collaborative and participatory within your team? Would you share a little bit about how you create these monumental pieces?
Well, sure. So the core of my practice are these large wall-mounted ceramic sculptures. There's a small, relatively small one behind me, but some of them are much, much larger. And so, of course, it's not possible for me to do it by myself. So I have a team of assistants. There are a total of 8 people who work here, mostly part-time. But when it comes time to build one of these pieces, we've all been working together for years. Some of the my colleagues have been with me for 15 years. So it's almost like a performance. It's there's something performative or theatrical about it because we all know how to do it. There's a sort of quick sketch, and then we dive in and build these pieces on the floor. And it's always an enjoyable experience, something we do together and understand. And there's a shorthand of communication that we have together, and it's, of course, it's very physical because some of these pieces are as require as much as 6 tons of clay for an individual piece. So there's a whole process of moving the clay around and unbagging it and stretching it out and pounding it into the floor. And so it's performative, and I sometimes it looks to me like agriculture because it's like people working on the ground and planting their hands in the ground. And of course, at the end of the day, it's very much about handling of clay and the joy of handling ceramic material, of handling the physical clay, and something that me and my colleagues all have in common, that we all enjoy working with clay. So it is this wonderful collaborative moment that we all share. And of course, then there's the product. The ultimate goal is to create these large pieces.
That's such a wonderful thing to point out to Peter, that visceral connection with the material that, most of us who are watching who don't ever get to experience something like that, right? And I wonder too, what other sensual aspects come into play? Is the fragrance of the clay, the music that you play, does this all kind of come into your alchemy and your process?
Well, hopefully it doesn't smell bad. I don't think it's the smell so much, but it's definitely a physical. It's definitely a physical process, and I think uh, the beauty of craft materials in general is the physical process and the presentation and the materiality of the work, and that's true with textiles and glass and everything, but especially with clay, where you manipulate it directly with your hands, and I think that's a common experience for most people who work in ceramics. That the physicality of the material is a great part of the appeal, and so I think that's if you haven't taken a pottery class, you should take one so that you should have that experience yourself.
I found it interesting, Peter, when I read your bio, that you came late to pottery and that you discovered it through a class. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't have an academic background, and but my background is that I went with some friends one day and took a pottery class. For me, it was a blessing that I was able to go and take a pottery class, and one thing led to another, and very quickly I had ideas and things that I wanted to make, and I found a market relatively early on through architects and interior designers, starting with smaller decorative pieces, planters and lamps and centerpieces, but very quickly moving on to these larger works. Um, Working with designers like Peter Marino and Bill Georges and Shahan Minassian, um, it happened very quickly, and so as the demand for my work increased, then I had to build a bigger studio. So that's where I find myself today.
So may I ask you both, Claire and Peter, you both are working in installation. Um, but one of the really magical things I think about this interplay between your work is that, Claire, yours, if I may, tends to be almost ephemeral and impermanent in the way that you're working with your installations. And Peter, you are creating very permanent architectural structures that become right part of the homes themselves. Um, so apart from disparities in installation, I'm curious if there are differences in the way you think about this or feel about this when you're embarking on something, like Claire thinking of it in terms of ephemerality, or Peter one that will remain and endure. Um, is there a difference in mindset, Claire, when you're approaching something?
Well, I think that's probably going to take a bit of talking through Peter, isn't it? Because I don't know what Peter's mindset is and doesn't know mine. So that's kind of quite fun. But I suppose I see that the ephemerality is part of the dialogue. You know, when I spend a lot of time working with collections, historic collections, really understanding the dedication. A lot of the collections I've worked with, they're not just things. They're stories. They're people. They're people who didn't know they were collectors, who just bought something just way too expensive one day, and then boom, they were a collector. And this relationship that they have, I kind of think that many ways the ephemeral works that I make are about really questioning, what are the things that stay, what are the things that go, and how human we all are in that process. So the ephemerality not only talks about material at different stages, but also in terms of something like the 4,000 bluebirds I made at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And they're not ephemeral. The whole artwork was ephemeral because it was there for a matter of 5 hours, but the actual objects, they're permanent, and they're really important to the people who were brave enough to walk into the Victoria and Albert Museum and steal a little bit of Wedgwood. That's their story. They know why they took it, and they know where they're keeping it. And so there's a sense of sometimes the whole object doesn't stay in one form. It kind of fractures, it moves off, and it becomes a shared ownership. So there's different points of ephemerality from what you see as the whole to where that goes to. And so it's exactly what Peter was talking about, which is the accessibility of clay. You know, if you collected one of the ceramic spoons I made on Westminster Bridge to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, then your job is to look after that one piece of clay. That's the responsibility. And so I think that in many ways we probably, Peter and I, are both making things that have relationships to people and places. Just some of mine you can tuck in a pocket. I don't imagine Peter's are that way.
But I'm going to be controversial here because I would argue that although Claire's work seemingly seems ephemeral because the exhibition is dismantled, it does have a legacy. It lives on, whether it is someone who can take a piece of the work home, which is fantastic, whether the exhibition, sometimes your exhibition goes to another museum, like Made in China, for example. You also have the legacy of exhibitions and it being written upon. So whereas Peter's work, which I'd love to hear what you have to say about why it's permanent, and it looks permanent, you're making these big, heavy walls, but you're working in a fashion industry, and the fashion industry is notorious for, what's the next thing. So when Chanel decides in 10 years that they don't want that look anymore, what are they going to do with your wall? And I'm a historian, design historian, and in the interior design world, it is, that despite all the wonderful historical societies that want to preserve things, it becomes a big issue. So that's the irony here. Like, Claire seems to be, ephemeral, you're permanent, but are you? That's my little, that's an angle that I think we need to consider and think about.
Well, as I said, permanence is relative, and as you point out, it's my work is connected to design and style and interior design and architecture, and of course tastes change. Now there's a demand for this brutal and roughly hewn work, and if I have to start making something in a different style, I certainly will. Hopefully, I will be able to adapt to changing tastes. And the reference that one of the touch points for me is the grotto that Bernard Palissy made for Catherine de' Medici, which, of course, when he made it, he assumed it was going to be there for forever, and it was ceramic, and fired ceramic is a very permanent material. But of course, once she was out, they effaced everything that was associated with her. So now there are just these little chunks. We have the drawings, we know what it looked like, and there are just these little chunks of the original piece. So it is even though it was built as a permanent object, it exists more with more resonance in our imagination. So, and that's whether something is physically real or fully conceptual, how we experience it is the essential detail.
That's such a beautiful way of reframing that. And I think, Claire, you stated that yourself when you said, I think that people would carry the experience forward. They would carry the physical memory of the experience. And in Forever, for example, at the Nelson Atkins, when you did the reproductions of the Sandbach Cup, um, you said, 1,345 people, I believe it was, committed to keeping that cup forever in a legally binding document. Could it be left in a will, buried with someone in a grave, or handed on? I thought that was just a phenomenal way of thinking about that and connecting it to history as well, whether we're thinking of Egyptian burials, whether we're thinking of contemporary. There's a way that your work is disseminating but enduring.
And I think that Forever, it's really interesting because it came from the deed that was given with the 1,345 objects that were given to bequeath to the museum. Then it's a document you won't see anymore. I mean, maybe Rachel, we should write one. Let's see what trouble we can get into. But you won't see a document like this anymore. It was a love letter to the museum, and it was written in the 1940s at some point. I should be murdered for not knowing the exact date, but it was really, we're giving you this collection. You will keep it forever. You must show it on permanent display forever. It's really is what collectors do. It's because they have, we make objects, right? But their collectors' collections are like one big object, and so it's this relationship of forever. And the deed that I asked the public to sign in kind of a replaying of this love letter was that they would keep it on permanent display in their home. They would not sell it. And there were 5 clauses, but the one that I enjoy the most is that over 10,000 people signed was that they would open their front door to any educational group who would like to see it. So there's this, massive, yeah, and it's that kind of relationship, and it makes the person who's making that commitment, it's like, are you really going to do that? I'm sure we must be coming up to an anniversary where I can test that soon, It's But you see, I think it's, talking about some of, monumentality is not always scale. It's the way that people are committing to it. Because you say, ceramics is a permanent thing, and it's that commitment to an object, a site-specific piece. Monumentality is about scale, and it's not always big scale.
The magnitude of your work, the scale is human, and it affects probably more people are affected by that piece than a lot of the things I make are in private homes and are experienced by relatively few people.
Yeah, and I bet there's such depth to those relationships as well. I'm fairly fascinated by that ongoing relationship. So for somebody in a private home, you have enabled them to have this. I firmly believe that collectors, they collect objects and they'll commission, but you know what, Peter, they're collecting you. They believe in everything you do, and there's such a human commitment inside commissioning artworks. It's so important to recognise that.
Well, I like to hope that that ultimately it's the material itself, the presence of the fired ceramic, which is so strong, and it has such a firm presence. I like to think that is something that communicates itself, and that's beyond that. I'm the facilitator of that. For me, my work is so action based and so much a process base that as opposed to a rendered image. So in a way, it's the experience that I'm sharing. The visceral quality of making the work is the beauty of the work.
Their practices on the one hand seem very, very dissimilar, whereas Peter is working for the architectural and the interior design community or with private clients, and Clare works with the museum world and with, and focuses on the collectors. So you might think, well, that's very disparate practices, but what in fact I think Clare and Peter have in common is how you both specialize in clay and in ceramics, but you have carved out a very specific niche that uh, and your own community. One is, the museum world, and the other is the architectural design community. And so in this way, it shows you how flexible and versatile and how huge this idea of what ceramics is in the expanded field. I also think what's very interesting when we compare your two practices is how you both discuss the idea of performance. And Peter, the performance is about the process and the making, whereas for Clare, the performance is in the process of the making, but it's very much tied to um, the result, the narrative of the exhibition itself. And so that's what I think is, it's not necessarily how you're making, and that's not the performance, but the performance is tied to how visitors will experience the exhibition, with the understanding that you're trying to highlight lost, artisan, lost craft form. So I think in that way, I think your works are very, very similar. And also what's so fascinating about your practices is that you are largely commission based. So you're invited, like Clare is invited by museums with historical collections to activate them, to respond to them. And whereas Peter, you are, commissioned by leading uh, interior designers, as well as, clients such as Robert Downey Jr. So you work in a very sort of commission-based field, which I think is also really fascinating about this new world of ceramics. And so, and you both work on the intersections of your field. Clare, it's the intersection of craft, art, museum, collecting, history, and Peter, it's the intersection between interior design, architecture, art, and applied arts. So again, meaning that ceramics doesn't really function on its own. It always intersects in this larger artistic world and sphere. But you each approach it from a very, very different lens, and yet you have so much in common in your practices. That's what I think is so fascinating about both your work.
I think that's really interesting in terms of the kinds of objecthood. In terms of we both transform a material, and we both rely on the material qualities to transform another situation. So I think, Peter, really thinking about what you were talking about, your presence within a collector's home, you've undertaken the act of transformation. And I think that, there's this, we can only be the conduits to clay because it has its own qualities. And I think that's what draws people to it.
Yeah, it's rooted in the earth, and I think people respond to that in many ways.
Well, I think, Peter, it's interesting how you pointed out that it lasts forever. And so what do we do when we discard it? And that is the biggest issue, because even though it lasts forever, it breaks and we have these shards and it doesn't go back to being dust.
But it's always possible for things to get buried. And there are, of course, archaeological examples. People dig up thousands of years later, and there are a lot of fantastic, like the Ishtar Gate is the great example of glazed brick. And they had to take it up, and it was all little puzzle pieces that they reassembled, and it's just a fantastic thing. But you get the presence. For me, there's always the presence of the maker and the presence of the context. With all art, even when I'm listening to music, it's as though I'm experiencing communication of the culture it's coming from. And so when I see the Ishtar Gate, I imagine that time and that place of making those bricks and what it must have been like to walk up that processional or more to the point of conceiving of building that and how they imagined and how they performed building the millions of glazed bricks. There's a fantastic photograph of oh, not Maria Martinez. I'll think of her. Native American ceramic artist. I'll think of her name in a second. But they gave her a historic pot, and the first thing she did was put her hand inside so she could feel the way that the person hundreds of years ago had made the same thing that she did. So there's a communication directly with the process.
The city to visit is Jingdezhen in China, which is the home of porcelain. And you can see what they do with all their detritus, all the broken shards. They use it to build roads. They use it to, build their light posts. It's everywhere. So it's in the ground and in their houses. So that's what's so fascinating, and how they've actually taken sort of, broken pieces of ceramics that either failed in the factory, or whether they were no longer in use and smashed, but then they were repurposed for other functions, which is also fascinating.
Would you mind, on that note, sharing with us the work that you did called Monument, which was an investigation into these pieces, these tiles that were held in a museum collection that you then reinvented and reinstalled into your exhibition?
Yeah, I think that it's really great to talk about Monument, because I've just remade it. Must be about 10 years since I made it. It's just been remade for the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. So the remaking of it, 10 years since it was last made, was really interesting, because I worked with French producers on the piece made for the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. So the monument reflects a great deal of the place where it's been made, the manufacturing or the waste in many ways. So the particular piece, Alisa, that you were talking about was made for the Zuiderzee Museum in Holland, and they had a massive problem. They had thousands and thousands of these Delft beautiful blue and white tiles that could not be used or restored in the museum because they were too broken, but they couldn't be thrown away because they were Dutch history. So the collection tiles were in a difficult situation, and so the director of the museum had to go to Dutch Parliament to ask permission whether I could use them. And so these tiles were laced into this work entitled Monument, which had broken shards from all across Europe, but specifically a great deal of them from this Dutch tile collection. So we were weaving these broken tiles into a larger narrative of historical beauty, but also waste. So we were looking at objects that had come from manufacturers in the UK, like Wedgwood, Port Miriam. Things that would be in museums were in this great big pile of rejects. So it was really a rethinking of what is waste, the objects that we have in museums, how do they become part of great collections. And of course, this was placed inside a museum that holds historically important objects. So it's really a rethinking. And in a way, the reason that it was just placed at the entrance of the exhibition, the Flams, was really a starting point. Rethink what you know about clay, rethink what you know about your cultures of preciousness. And so in a way, the materials we use only interrupt the cycle of production, and we take them out of the production process from Gion, from Revol, from the producers who gave the project, and they will go back in to that process when we finish with the sculpture. So Monument, this great big work, is impermanent. It's just taking something out of a process. We show and display its cultural resonance, and then it's placed back into that process, because all of those tiles will be recycled.
Well, and on that note of talking about contemporary work and production and this extraordinary and wonderful new movement that we're seeing which of course isn't new, but perhaps is just coming to the foreground for some of us in a mainstream way, um, is this, revival of ceramics. And Rachel, I wondered if we may ask you, um, you are obviously putting into historical context what this work can do, and you're working not only globally in your scholarship, but also in California, which has its own individual history of ceramic work. And I wondered if we could ask you, in your perspective, why we're seeing this sort of revival, if you would, now.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think we are certainly seeing a material turn in art practice in general, and we've been seeing that for the last 10 years or so. And perhaps it's a reaction to the digital age, and we're always on our screens and on our computers, and we just listened to Peter, who took up pottery, on a whim. So there is a real increase in the DIY movement, and whether it's knitting or whether it's in ceramics. And so it's not surprising that this is also spilled into art practice as well. So, there's not these strict barriers that one needs to study and adopt a material. There's a loosening up of who can work in a certain craft. So people are encouraged to, break the boundaries. So I think that might explain why we're seeing this sort of ceramic movement, this material turn. But I also think it's the breakdown of hierarchy of constitutes uh, um, the right material to work with. Like, what is should visual art be higher than craft? Should painting be, higher than sculpture? So there's always been a strong hierarchy of the different art forms that have really existed, since the breakdown, since the 18th century. In the Renaissance, it was much more open and even, and Michelangelo, was an architect, he was a sculptor. And artists at that time, like Bernini, would work in clay, would work with terracotta to create their maquettes, but they would move to marble or stone because it was considered, reductive. You weren't adding to it, so it was difficult. It was considered to be require a greater skill. So I think one of the reasons why ceramics was sort of diminished as this wonderful art form in the history of arts was that it was because it was so responsive and malleable. It wasn't considered to require the same amount of skill than, let's say, carving was. But when you move into the 19th century, you have Rodin, and he's working with terracotta as well. And then what becomes really interesting is the arts and crafts movement. The arts and crafts movement really starts embracing all craft forms and elevates ceramics again, whether it's ceramic tiles that are furnishing your interiors, whether it's art pottery and the idea of having art manufacturers. And then that's the 19th century. Then you move into the 20th century, and you get a whole different dialogue. And the dialogue is it a pot? Is it an ethical pot? Or is it an art pot? And then you have people, now we'll come to California at last, and you'll have someone like Peter Volkos, who will be influenced by the abstract expressionist movement, and he will disrupt the pot, and he will break it up, and it becomes a vessel. It's not just a pot, it's a metaphor. It's not just functional. So we have this whole sort of, yin and yang, and then you can take the whole idea of clay. Is it a canvas that you can paint on? Is it, or can it be used for figurative art in of itself? Right now at the Proper Art Museum, we have a wonderful exhibition on Stephen de Stabler, and it was a very important artist who worked in the medium of clay, contemporaries with Peter Volkos, so really active in the 70s and 80s, but he really contributed to the figurative movement and used clay as his primary medium, not just bronze, which is where often artists go to when they want that permanence, when they say, okay, we can't work with clay anymore. If you want to be taken seriously, you got to work with bronze. But anyway, Stephen Gotlieb was amazing. So that's sort of a very roundabout narrative of this sort of tension between whether ceramics is fine art or not. But I think this material turn is really, I think, partly in reaction against the digital and the collapsing of boundaries of different disciplines and craft, and this idea that it's not just about skill, it's about emotion and approach. So that's what's so exciting about it. And the art world has opened up. So whether it's Clare Twomey or whether it's Edmund Duvall or Theaster Gates in Chicago, like these artists are, represented by major galleries, and we live in this expanded field.
Thank you so much for that. That was extraordinary. And may I ask you, when we first started talking, we were touching on some of the artists that you thought were important to pay attention to watch right now, emerging, younger in their careers. Do you mind if we touch a bit on those as well, on a few of them?
Sure, I can. Now that I was originally from Toronto, so but I'm going to talk about some of the really interesting artists based in California. There is Alex Anderson, who's based in LA, and then there is Woody Othello, who's based in Oakland. Both artists are BIPOC artists, and they're really addressing issues today of what it means to be a Black artist or a Black queer artist. In the case of Alex Anderson, and where's their role, where's their place, and but they're very grounded in history. I would say that Woody Othello really is influenced by the funk movement in local California. He came from Miami, but you can see sort of the work of Bob Arneson. There's humor. Viola Fry, he works in a monumental scale, but there's something very serious about his work. And then with Alex Anderson, it's very decorative. He's looking at identity. He's looking at I like to call it the term queer baroque, because it does deal with it's very, the work is very florid, but it's also ironic. You think it's porcelain, but it's low-fired earthenware, and he inserts his own identity within these very sort of ornate, mirror-like clay canvases. So I think those are two very exciting artists to watch who are new and young, and contributing to this important dialogue about how art can challenge you, and it can challenge you about critical issues um, that you face today, and about belonging. And I'll just add that in a few weeks' time, in the middle of March, we are hosting NCICA, which is a national conference on the education of ceramic arts. And we are hosting an exhibition that they organized that is all about belonging. And it's all about emerging young artists. Many of them are BIPOC artists that are working in clay and thinking about how do they belong. And it could be about their personal identity. It could be about land rights that have been, stolen from them. So it's a fantastic show. And I think this is a very political side of looking at ceramics. And that's not to say that ceramics doesn't have a deep and long history with political messages, because it does. It was a way in Elizabethan times and later to communicate, your message, whether you believed in your king or you didn't. All that was communicated through the charger that you displayed on your walls, right? And so it's interesting to see that side of ceramics as well. It's a huge and fantastic field.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that. And Sika, the conference called Fertile Ground is taking place in Sacramento, yes, March 16th through 19th. So for the Bay Area community, or rather, obviously anyone who can make that pilgrimage virtually or physically, there's an abundance of incredible programming available to learn more. And just lastly, if we may turn to you, Claire and Peter, for your thoughts on this. Claire, I would love to hear your thoughts on Les Flammes, and Chris, or rather, Peter, you mentioned Chris Schenk as an artist that you've been watching, who actually has a show opening up at Museum of Art and Design in New York, I think around the same time this week, actually, in March, rather February 12th. So, yeah. Would you mind sharing a bit about his practice and why it's caught your eye?
Just, I'm interested that you talked about materiality as a response to a digital age, which is so true. But at the same time, I know all these people via Instagram. So, I mean, I know Alex Anderson. I've never met him, but I know his work so well, and I think he's a fantastic artist. But I know all about all of this because of Instagram, and it's the same with Chris Schenk. I've seen his work in person, and it's very beautiful. And he's one of many artists working today in this kind of crazy brutalist, out there, unmoored to traditional styles or craft traditions, and so it's this crusty, bubbly furniture forms that are all coated with colorful metallic foils. Takara Kawada is the artist. Another.
I think Takara influences your work. I was going to ask you.
Oh, I should be so lucky.
Walls behind you on your clay. Yeah.
Well, there's a great piece. This is by another Japanese artist by name Ken Kitade, but yeah. So yeah, there are so many great artists working in very inventive ways today, and non-traditional craft.
And Claire, I'm so eager to hear what you saw that really sparked your thinking at Les Flammes, um, which is this comprehensive encyclopedic exhibition of new work in Paris at the moment, or it may have just closed. Could you share a little bit about what caught your eye there?
I think that kind of culturally, it's really interesting to see Les Flammes because it is such a vast overview, such an ambitious exhibition. It's not a survey show. It's really, really about looking at ceramics afresh, and the curator and the research has been done so thoroughly that for anybody who comes from a clay context, maybe studied it, maybe has worked with it for a long time, you can walk into this exhibition and it will refresh your knowledge, 10 times over. So there are the sections in the exhibition, they take you through a tour, but it's so unexpected. So there'll be people in technique you don't expect to see there, people in production. It's what Anne has done in the curation has revised it from a very contemporary view with a historic understanding. That's a hard feat to pull off for the world of clay.
I'm going to just add, having curated Clare's show piece by piece, I would say that all your exhibitions are transformational for visitors. They have never seen clay like that, and that's what's so amazing. And you always work on a monumental scale because you work with large numbers, and so people think of ceramics, they might think of a single pot or their grandmother's china surface. And when you see how you've made so many of them, it becomes an incredible installation, and so it's amazing for visitors. And you've done such an incredible job changing the general public's perception about ceramics and why it's meaningful and so important to our lives.
And I think Rachel, the work that we made together did that, and it allowed me to then go on to work at the Tate Modern, build the factory, and really understand, how communities will come. They will really come to be involved in what is communities of practice, and they experience it for a moment, but then they can go and seek them when they return to wherever they've come from. There's this communication of material that you can seek it in your community.
Open to all, inspiring to all. It's a beautiful way to think about it. And so, in closing, I see we're at about an hour. I just want to open it up and ask you all if there's anything else you would like to touch on.
And I would just say that during NCECA, we will have a World of Clay. Our whole second floor exhibition gallery will be devoted to clay in addition to belonging. The Stephen DeStabler exhibition will be up, and it's a very focused look on his monumental figures and on his clay masks, and they really speak to our human condition. We have a really amazing exhibition of contemporary Japanese ceramics, and they really show wonderful innovations in contemporary Japanese ceramics and tremendous amount of skill, whether it's a sculptural form or whether it's a simple pot. It's extraordinary and inspirational, and I would say that contemporary Japanese ceramics are some of the finest potters working today. So that's a wonderful exhibition. And then for something completely different, we of course will be showing an exhibition called The Candy Store, and that talks about the funk movement that was so important in California, the Bay Area, that really, snubs what was going on in the East, and embraces everything from frogs to self-portraits of artists that are made to look like, Bernini busts, famously by Bob Arneson. A great show, and it's called The Candy Store because this was all displayed in a gallery called The Candy Store that was located in Folsom, which is just outside of Sacramento. So lots of great things to see at the Crocker.
How great that you're hosting NCECA, which is always a fantastic opportunity to look at ceramics from so many perspectives. Whenever I've been to an NCECA, it's the conference and there's people meeting each other, but there's always incredible gallery and museum exhibitions. And yeah, so for anybody who's interested in ceramics, and going to NCECA is always going to be an eye opener.
Right. So exactly, because the convention center will be filled with demonstrations and talks, and then Sacramento, Davis, Berkeley, they'll all be offsite exhibitions for people to see.
Okay, my plug is that I have a monograph that will be available in the spring. So keep tuned. I'll send out an email when it's ready, and you can order it online, electronically.
And I think you shared, Peter, there were some wonderful contributors to that monograph. You say Glenn Adamson.
Oh, Glenn Adamson has written a beautiful essay for me, and Dorothée Charles who's the director of the Cartier Foundation in America, has contributed an essay, and I have an introduction by Peter Marino and contributions by Shahan Manassian and Emily Summers, who's an interior designer based in Dallas. So all the people I've had the opportunity to collaborate with over the years, and it's basically focusing on my more monumental work, and basically the past 12 years that I've been building these larger pieces. So it's a chance for me to communicate that as a book.
Well, then, in a formal closing, thank you so much. Our deepest gratitude to all of you for taking the time out from your incredibly busy schedules. Rachel at the museum, Peter and Claire, thank you.